Welcome back, degenerates, degeneritas, and degenerati, to the MMA Racks pod for UFC 307, Pereira versus Roundtree Jr., live from beautiful Salt Lake City, Utah. This card, it's gotten mixed opinions in terms of, some people saying it's a deep card, even if it's not a very top-heavy card. I don't think it's a very great card, to be honest. It's, 306. There were some people a little bit curious about how that one was going to go, and I think up until the last three fights, it was ended up being pretty solid in terms of seeing some nice MMA battles. Obviously, Zellhuber versus Ribovics, in which yours truly correctly picked the underdog, was one of the best fights of the year, one of the best third rounds you'll ever see in any MMA fight. I'm not as excited for this one. I've only got 8 picks, and I'm hedging on rounds in a lot of cases in this one. Some of the lines I think are pretty goofy. A lot of the grades I have pretty close. I just think it's interesting that, even if we are going to downgrade this card a bit, that there's a lot of context in terms of how we arrived at this point that I'm going to talk about pretty heavily when breaking down the main event between Alex Pereira and Khalil Roundtree in relation to something that actually happened at the most recent UFC event. So before we get into that, let me just remind you real quick to please like, share, and subscribe to the YouTube channel and the Twitter account if you have not already. I greatly appreciate it. Last episode was the second most viewed episode of the Racks Pod that I have had, and go figure, we've almost doubled the subscriber count from what it was around the start of July. So thank you very much for that. I apologize that I didn't do any minute-to-minute breakdowns last week. I didn't really make an announcement or anything. I meant to get around to it, but I had a couple different fights that I was just staying off, and I just wasn't really feeling it. So my apologies for not providing any context. I know a lot of people have been tuning into those, at least relative to how many viewers the Racks Pod has been getting, but thank you very much for tuning in all the same. I appreciate it, and I will be more diligent with those in the future. Since I committed to doing those, I hadn't missed a single fight night event relative to the main card picks for putting out minute-to-minute breakdowns on that. So I will be more diligent about that in the future. But speaking of last week's event, let's do a quick recap before getting into the 8 fights on this one. Because I've got a lot to talk about relative to at least one of those fights. So usually, if you're familiar with the format at this point, how I do the recaps, I don't really reflect on the wins because, the analysis was good. No need to look back. We keep moving forward. If the underdog picks, if any of them didn't hit, plus money's plus money. We don't worry about it too much. If the favorites did not land, one or multiple, it is important to review what happened and put it into context in terms of if it's something that you need to factor into the analysis going forward or if it was just bad luck. And last week, I don't think it had anything to do with the analysis. Starting quickly with Balaji Oki versus Chris Duncan. I said it from one of the very, very first weeks that I ever put out picks for this account back in June of 2022, 2 years ago. And it was actually in relation to someone who's going to be fighting further up on this card, Mario Batista, when he was fighting Brian Kelleher. I wanted to pick Batista so bad, because he's one of my favorite fighters I've evaluated since I started doing this, and somebody who I thought was going to be an up-and-comer in the bantamweight division, much like Jonathan Martinez. So it's interesting to see that Martinez kind of had his momentum stalled out by Jose Aldo, and now Batista has fallen into the same event, or the same opponent, rather. But one of the things that deterred me from picking Batista in that case was I wasn't supremely confident in how his submission defense would hold up at that stage, and I was extremely worried about the prospect of because that was, I think, the first fight on the card when he was fighting 2 years ago in June. Having parlays killed early in the night by Brian Keller getting a guillotine, which is his signature submission. Now, obviously, Kelleher's career has kind of fallen from grace, if you want to call it grace, since then, most recently losing to Cody Gibson. But I was deterred from that just because I didn't want to have an early event ruined by a guillotine. It is funny that, I made a note of pointing out that when I put the parlays in after weigh-ins on Friday, that we had once again run into a situation where the main book that I use, just because it's the most accessible to anybody around the world, BetOnline, was not allowing the Oki fight for an undisclosed reason to be used in the parlay betting when all the other fights were eligible. I reached out to their customer associates to try to get an explanation why that was, and they just said, quote, the discretion of the line manager. Now, the funny thing was, when I checked about a half hour before the event began the next day, the fight had been enabled for parlay betting. And at that point, Oki was actually available at minus 155, about 30 points better than where he was the day before that, and when he wasn't eligible for parlay betting. So whether it has to do with them, being welcome to take more action now that the price had been, or the line had come down a bit, more action had come in on Duncan, remains to be seen. In any event, Duncan ended up getting the win despite getting pieced up on the feet because Oki made a very curious decision to wrestle when he didn't really need to. I don't know if he was encouraged by the first exchange they had on the ground where he was, kind of still getting the better of Duncan, but then ended up going back to the well for, I think, another takedown and got caught in an arm-in guillotine. And it was just a really obscure exchange because even Duncan, when he let go of the guillotine, wasn't aware that Oki was actually out. The ref wasn't aware. Nobody could really tell what was going on until they kind of settled in and realized, oh, he's actually unconscious, so the fight needs to end. Just a very bizarre exchange. Another example of why a guillotine is one of the most random and disappointing outcomes for any bettor. Another really brilliant example that I can recall was when Dalcha Lungiambula fought Cody Brundage. That was the third event from when I actually started analyzing these fights, but I actually skipped it that week because I was in the hospital. And I remember a lot of people that bet Lungiambula, who I think was a pretty healthy favorite and was absolutely had Brundage really badly hurt. Brundage jumped a guillotine. Lungiambula's sub-defense wasn't there. He ends up winning and spoiling a lot of parlays. So it was, just another example of how a guillotine can just kind of be random bad luck for you. But I didn't put that in any of the parlays because it wasn't eligible. And it was interesting that, this is the second time within the last couple of months that something like this has happened with BetOnline as a book specifically. At UFC Vegas 94, they made the day before the event when the weigh-ins were happening, the Cody Gibson, Brian Kelleher, as well as the Bruno Silva versus Cody, forgive me. It was Bruno Silva versus Cody Durden. Those two fights were not eligible for parlay betting. The next day they were enabled before the event started. So I was able to put those two picks in the moonshot after I checked again. But when I was making my main parlays the day before, after weigh-ins were confirmed done, I wasn't able to include Cody Gibson as a parlay leg, which I really wanted to do, and I wasn't able to make a parlay that was tailored around Bruno Silva being an underdog, although I wasn't sure if the line had flipped at that point. I know it was pretty close to a pick'em, if memory serves. So it is what it is, but if you are someone that uses the book of the world, as I like to call it, you're going to want to keep an eye on that going forward, because it's interesting that I don't know if it's just negligence, like it's some kind of input error that they don't have a fight eligible for parlays and then they turn it on, or if they are actually monitoring how much exposure they have to the other side or the favorite versus the underdog, and then when there's a little bit more balance, they actually let it in for parlays. Because it's interesting that they will allow the fights to still be bet as a money line and still allow prop betting, but they won't let you include them in parlays for some reason. I don't really understand that. I will say I didn't really see anybody on Duncan last week. It was mostly people betting Olaki or Balaji Oki. So I wonder how much exposure they really did have to Oki, and they probably ended up coming out pretty well on that based on what the result was. But thankfully, it wasn't a big deal, but it is something to monitor just relative to that book going forward, because granted, I don't really have a lot of experience at any other books, but I do think it's I can't say that I've seen that kind of behavior from another book the way that one does. But again, they're the book of the world, and they're legislated out of a small Latino American country. So what are you going to do in terms of that's the risk you invite when you play offshore. Anyway, the one that I really want to talk about, as I'm sure most of you can probably guess, is the other favorite that didn't land for me among my picks at UFC Paris. Joe Anderson Brito and William Gomez. It's a stone cold robbery. There's really no other way to put it. I'm not going to go as far as to say, in the immediate aftermath, I wanted to say there's a better case for Brito 30-27 than Gomez 29-28. I think that would have been a little bit emotionally charged. I can see how you make a better argument for Gomez winning the final round. All three judges gave him round 3, so I think it kind of cheapens the argument a little bit that, giving Brito that final round probably wasn't going to be accurate. And, it did seem like maybe I don't want to say he took the last round off, but you do want to see from a fighter in that situation where they're going to be fighting against not only the opponent, but the crowd firmly in their favor. You do want to see them put the fight away, even if you think they have the first 2 rounds banked. So maybe Brito thought he did enough to win the first 2 and then kind of coasted to the end to avoid getting hurt. I don't really think that was the case, but regardless of what you think, he didn't outright win the 3rd round. He did outright win the 2nd round, and the judges' scorecards reflected that. The 1st round, I don't understand how you make an argument for Gomez winning it. If you're going to make an argument that it was based on damage, the most significant exchange relative to damage that they had was right before Brito jumped the guillotine at the end of the round, when Gomez was backed up by, I think it was a haymaker or some kind of overhand throw that Brito made. That was the most significant moment of damage on the feet in the entire round. Gomez, when he had top control, did absolutely no damage with it. I don't even think he landed any of his strikes. And Brito, most of his significant strikes in the round came when he had control. So he did more with his control than Gomez did. Gomez may have had more strikes landed on the feet, but at the end of the round, the significant strikes were dead even at 9 apiece. So you can't make an argument based on volume that Gomez won the round. You can't make an argument based on control that Gomez won the round. And then on top of all of that, the round ended with Brito jumping a guillotine that Gomez did not escape from. So not only is the end of the round very significant in terms of how you're supposed to, or how judges often are grading these exchanges, but also he didn't get out. And that's the time that you want to see fighters try risky submissions like that, especially ones that have the potential to gas out their arms. It's something that I really like seeing from Jun Young Park, is that he's very, very savvy in terms of the times that he chooses to deploy his submissions. He does it at the end of the round to avoid the risk of gassing himself out on those kind of chokes. Brito, I think, very, very wisely opted at the end of that round to try the guillotine, even though it didn't end up working well for him. But I don't understand how you can possibly make an argument that Gomez won the first round. There's just no way to do it based on what I just laid out for you. The only argument, or it's not even an argument, just the only factor that you can say was that the French crowd gave Gomez the bigger pop. And it wasn't French judges that gave him the decision. I believe it was Ben Cartledge and then one other guy who I wasn't familiar with his name, but when I looked up on MMA decisions, he had been judging other fights on that card, and he had other UFC events previously. So it wasn't just like some obscure French person that, the French mafia, if you will, just kind of inserted in there. He was a judge with experience. It still baffles me that they gave Gomes the first round of that fight. There's really no argument for it. And I was pretty dismayed. I won't go as far as to say upset, but it was frustrating to see not only a potentially profitable night for me ruined by that, but then also for people that bet on Gomes to very disingenuously act like their read was correct, as if they hadn't just been given a gift by the judges. I try to be pretty conciliatory in terms of when I recognize that a fight ended up being a robbery. The most brilliant example I can think of is when Patty fought Jared Gordon. I picked Patty to win, and even I was like, wow, okay, Patty really did not deserve to win that. In other fights where it's closer, I usually am pretty emphatic about making an argument that the fight was at least close and could have been interpreted either way. I know I pissed off a few different people doing that for, Ricardo Ramos against Josh Culibao. I know there were a bunch of very frustrated Culibao bettors, and that, they were so mad they were even trying to take personal insults at me, which okay, whatever, comes with the territory of showing your face, I guess, on doing this. But, you deal with adversity your whole life. You can take it on the chin, so to speak. But I'm usually pretty conciliatory, even, when my underdog, and I'm like, oh, I made the right read, so I was correct. Another example I can think of relative to someone fighting on this card was when Austin Hubbard fought, I think, Michael Figlak in his last fight, and that wasn't a split. That was a unanimous decision, but that was a fight that a lot of people made the argument that Figlak should have won, and it was ridiculous that it wasn't even a split. There are a lot of fighters on this card that have been given the grace or suffered the carnage to their career that comes with a split decision that doesn't go their way. And that's going to be a theme that I talk about relative to how this main event has come to pass. But just to kind of put a bow on all of this, there's no fucking way that Gomes won that fight. And if you think otherwise, forgive me. Especially, I know, it was 10-3, I think, in terms of media members on MMA decisions that scored it in favor of Brito. One of the people that scored it for Gomes is one of the earliest followers I had on this account, Dane Fox, who left Bloody Elbow after its demise and now is at Sherdog. And although I am grateful to Fox for his early support, he's not correct in terms of his evaluation of that fight. And frankly, you have very skewed perspective if you think Gomes won that fight for any reason other than he was the French guy in France. That was an absolute robbery. I don't know if I would go as far as to say it's one of the worst split decisions of this year, because there have been some really, really bad ones, even ones that didn't go in favor of the guy that shouldn't have won. Jairzinho Rozenstruik versus Tai Tuivasa only a couple pay-per-views ago comes to mind. But there is absolutely no argument for Gomes winning that fight. There just isn't. If that fight takes place outside of France, different set of judges, different crowd, Brito wins. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind. So all you people taking a victory lap like, oh, I called it was the right read and everything. No. It's a judge's gift. And karma will come for you in terms of celebrating that victory. Because I've done this long enough where I recognize that I've been both victimized and gifted results by the judges on a variety of different angles. And again, I'm going to talk about that further up the card. But thankfully, even though there wasn't really any retribution against most of the people that bet Gomes, there was against the people of France that wanted to see their god of war, Benoit Saint-Denis, get a win over Renato Money Moicano. So everybody celebrated. Oh, Joanderson Brito, not the winner over William Gomis. only a couple fights later was pretty devastated by the result. Now they do have a legit title contender now in Imavov, but I thought Imavov pretty clearly won his fight outright. So there was nothing wrong with him getting a 29-28 unanimous over Brendan Allen. But it was very funny to me that Benoit Saint, especially someone that bet the under, and you want to talk about being gifted a result, I was very grateful that the doctor in that case did what the French are perhaps best known for and waved the white flag to stop a violent conflict. I was very grateful the doctor did that because I didn't think that fight was going to end in the first half of the third round. I even thought Benoit Saint Denis was going to win just based on Moicano's chin history and Benoit's, not really going further than the first two rounds in most of the fights that he wins. He's only gone the distance once in his MMA career and he lost. Interestingly enough, that result with the doctor's stoppage is kind of an interesting callback to when he made his UFC debut, when he went the distance and lost to Elizeu Zaleski dos Santos in a fight where the referee was heavily condemned for not stopping the fight due to the damage that Saint Denis had suffered. Saint Denis got a lot of respect won in that fight for toughing it out and going the distance and not getting finished. The referee, I believe, in that fight actually got removed from assignment after that result and did not officiate again. I think that fight was in Abu Dhabi, but I believe he was a Russian ref, and he didn't work again after that. So Benoit Saint Denis' career began with what should have been a doctor's stoppage loss, and the first main event of his UFC career ends up ending in a doctor's stoppage loss. So it's funny how those things go. It is a great example of why I love to hedge on rounds when you're not confident or you think that a favorite is overvalued, which I did think in the case of Saint Denis. If that fight was lined inside of 200, if we were getting something like, minus 150, 160 on Saint Denis, I would have felt good about taking that. And I think that would have been more appropriate for him coming off a knockout loss to Dustin Poirier than the price that at nearly 3-1 that was coming out for this fight against Moicano. So big ups to Moicano bettors. I don't think that was a bailout at all. He absolutely 10-8'd him in the first round. And even though I made that joke about the doctor waving the white flag, I think it was absolutely the right decision in that case. So that's about it for UFC Paris. We've got 8 fights to talk about for this upcoming card, and we'll get started right now. So let's kick it off with Tim Means and Court McGee. The Dirty Bird enters 33-16-1, was most recently knocked out at Fight Night Nicolau Perez at the end of April by Uros Medic. Medic was around a 300 favorite going into that fight. I believe I advocated for staying away, even though Medic obviously performed a price in that case. Means was someone that I've, looked pretty favorably upon in most of his recent performances due to his just the wealth of UFC experience he has, and his numbers are pretty good overall as well. It's interesting that he's had as much success as he's had kind of in this late stage of his career, although the last 2 years haven't necessarily been kind to him. The first fight that I ever graded with him, I advocated for staying away from his result with Kevin Holland. Holland obviously made that fight, I don't want to say non-competitive, but I think handled him pretty effectively as something like a minus 300 favorite. Griffin, the Max Griffin fight, I believe I took the plus 2.5, and I felt pretty vindicated by that, given that it did go to split decision, although most people, again, the theme of split decisions is going to be pretty heavy on this episode. That was one in which case a lot of people were kind of left bewildered by the fact that any of the judges could have scored that for Tim Means. People felt like Griffin got that decision pretty handily. I tend to agree with them, but again, I had the hedge on rounds, thought I was going to go over, and felt pretty vindicated by the fact that it went to a split. Alex Morono, I took Means as an underdog, and I've heard it's interesting that people. This is one of the things in which I tend to see that people don't. They look at a result, and if it ends in a finish, they just assume that a fighter got wiped. Tim Means won the first round against Alex Morono. He was winning the fight, and then Morono just got him in a guillotine, much like what we talked about earlier with Oki and Duncan, and Means just got submitted. It was on, and that's kind of been Means' Achilles heel his whole career. He's got a 5-7 submission record. One of the rare, very successful fighters at the UFC level with this much experience that has a losing record on submissions, despite the fact that he's got 5 submission wins in his MMA career. Got caught in a guillotine and lost, and that he's actually got 2 submission losses in his last 5 results, including the aforementioned one with Holland. When he fought Andre Filo, he was an underdog again. I thought that was kind of surprising, given even though I had backed Filo in other spots, I recognized that Filo had kind of taken way too many consecutive knockouts and probably wasn't long for the UFC, whereas Means was a much more established commodity. I took Means as an underdog. That was almost exactly a year ago at Fight Night Physique Gamrot, and Means won by 3rd round knockout. I think the first part of the fight was competitive, but Means kind of very steadily pulled away, and Filo just proved he had taken too much damage at that point to stick around in the UFC. And then the Medic fight, obviously, I said I advocated for staying away. So I haven't ever outright said to bet against this guy, Tim Means, but also he's been an underdog in his last 5 fights. I'm not sure when the last time he was favored. My guess is it was probably against Laureano Staropoli, but that was back in August of 2020. It's possible he was favored over Mike Perry or Nicholas Dalby. The Dalby win has at least aged well for him, but outside of that Dalby result, there's not really a lot on here that, would make you say, based on recent success, this guy really should be outright, a 2.5 to 1 favorite over Court McGee. As for McGee, he enters 22-13. Most recently lost to Alex Morono by unanimous decision. I took the plus 2.5 rounds in that fight and made it a parlay leg. It ended up cashing, but there was definitely a moment very early in the fight. I think it was basically the only moment of outright success McGee had where he hurt Morono very, very early on, and I think that was enough to give him the first round. The second, I think he hurt Morono, but he didn't get a knockdown. Morono ended up kind of doing better in terms of volume of strikes. And then I believe in the second round, Morono tried shooting a guillotine, or jumping guillotine rather. It didn't go well for him. McGee was able to get out because he's got very good submission defense. He's never been submitted in his MMA career. And I've talked about before how as fighters get older, the one thing that tends to consistently improve for them is their submission defense. He was able to control Morono for the rest of the round. It was 1-1 going into the third, despite the fact that Morono was a very wide favorite to close. And Morono just kind of had more for him on the feet at that point and was able to out-volume him and get a 29-28 unanimous decision. Prior to that, McGee was a favorite over Matt Brown, and I can't recall if he was winning before he got knocked out, but looking at it again from Fight Night Rosenstrike Almeida, it doesn't look... the significant strikes were pretty close. He was at least more active than Brown was. He had thrown 31 strikes and landed 8. Wasn't as accurate, obviously, as Brown, and then Brown, obviously, with the 1 strike that ended the fight. I mean, what a way to end a career for that guy. I mean, one of the most underrated knockouts of last year. And I had actually graded Brown to win, but I was just too worried about the prospect of him showing up old to roll with it. But that was just another example of what I've talked about before. When you've got an underdog graded to win, you're better off just going with it than leaving it on the shelf and wondering what could have been. Because that could have added to what was a profitable night for me at that Fight Night UFC Charlotte. But I also had Brian Battle as an underdog that night, so I was at least happy with that. The first time I ever evaluated a fight of McGee's was Fight Night Qatar Emmett, one of the first events that I had with this account after publishing it. Now it took the over against Jeremiah Wells. And I did that on the basis that McGee hadn't been knocked out since fighting Santiago Ponzinibbio in 2016 and had a slew of results going to the distance since then. And obviously Wells is just, at the other end of the athleticism spectrum than McGee is, and totally nuked him almost inside of 90 seconds. So that was not a good bet. I do think I had that as a parlay leg that night, actually. So it was, unfortunate to see that. That was, I think, a pretty good case of a fighter showing up old, despite the fact that he had competed earlier in that year and beaten a fighter that many were optimistic about in Ramiz Brahimaj. But I think that showed, too, against a young fighter like that has such grappling credentials as Brahimaj does, or at least, gets praised for that, which is why he was, I can't recall if he was a favorite when he fought Themba Gorimbo. I think he might have been an underdog, but I know a lot of people were very optimistic about him as an underdog going into that fight. But the fact that he handled himself against someone that's that credentialed on the ground, I think, presents a little bit more optimism for McGee in this spot than perhaps he's getting. I do worry that because McGee's success has been so heavily based on getting the fight to the ground, that if he's not able to consistently do that, or at least do that in 2 rounds in this fight, Means is probably going to piece him up on the feet. But he is a pretty healthy underdog here, and I do think that if McGee, Means obviously is, he's never fighting a clean measure performance. He's always kind of mixing it up and grinding and make it dirty, putting it in the clinch. And I think that's just going to give McGee opportunities to, when they get into those condensed spaces, to potentially get takedowns and put the fight on the floor. So I think this is really going to come down to how good is Means at getting back to his feet, which is something he hasn't necessarily had to do a lot in his recent performances, but I do believe it's one of the reasons that he ended up losing to Max Griffin. And the fact that, again, this is one of the only fights on the card, perhaps the only fight on the card, where a fighter is fighting locally. McGee is born and raised in Utah. I think he's going to firmly have the crowd in his corner here. And Means, I think that they matched him up with McGee here because they want to give McGee a winnable fight in what I suspect is going to be his last fight in the UFC. And given the fact that McGee is a former Ultimate Fighter winner, I have to imagine that the UFC is trying to give him a potentially nice send-off here, where they can kind of just boost the profile of one of their former winners, or at least guys that they wanted to back and give a bit of a push to in what's going to be a send-off. So I do think the UFC is kind of trying to do McGee a bit of a favor here. Again, I am worried about him being able to deploy a ground heavy, or at least take down necessary game plan at his age. But the fact that he's fighting someone a year older than him, he's not getting a younger opponent, makes me at least a little bit optimistic that the two of them are going to kind of be in a bit of a dirty, slow-paced fight that will give McGee opportunities to put this fight on the floor the way he needs to. So I think it's going to be a close fight, and I do think McGee's going to get at least one of the rounds. I don't think he's just going to get totally blown out. Means would be well served to keep this at distance, but I don't, just based on the way that the guy likes fighting, I don't necessarily think that's what's going to happen, even if he does end up having more success on the feet. It'll be up to McGee to make the most of his moments on the ground with effective ground and pound. He's only got, I believe, he's got 2 submission wins in his UFC career, if you include the Ultimate Fighter finale that he won on. But he hasn't won by submission since the fight after that, which was all the way back in 2011. But against an opponent like this, like Means, that has a losing submission record, I think he would be well served to try to pursue that avenue to victory, even if he is averaging less than half a submission attempt per 2 fights that go per 15 minutes in his UFC career. I am going to take McGee just, as the hometown dog, and I think he's going to get a 29-28 Decision win, possibly a split, but again, based on the fact that Means hasn't been favored over his last 5 opponents, he's coming off a first-round knockout loss. I think that Means is pretty overvalued here, and I think that McGee's being a bit disrespected. He's not fighting a nuclear hitter the way that he did in 2 of his last 3 results that led to 2 of the only 3 knockouts that he's had in his MMA career. Means is very much more of an attrition-based striker and somebody that doesn't like to keep things at distance, really likes to grind in the clinch and make things close and dirty. And I think inviting that is just going to give opportunities to McGee to shoot, and it's going to come down to how well is Means going to keep himself upright on the fence, and if he does get taken down, what is his get-up game going to look like? So give me McGee to win 29-28. The next fight is Ryan Spann and Ovince St. Preux, a rebooking from a fight night a month ago in which St. Preux fell ill the week of the fight. Unfortunately, that was a case in which losing that fight from the card rather prompted me to skip the event on an event I otherwise would have made profit on, with the suggestion for the parlay I put out, even though I didn't actually put out the parlay. So that was, I think, the 4th Apex event I've skipped this year. So it was regrettable to skip that, obviously, but you live and learn. Anyway, Spann enters 21-10. Most recently got knocked out by Bogdan Guskov at Fight Night Nicolau Perez. I had made Spann a parlay leg on at least, I think, one parlay that night. And he very, very clearly won the first round, was dominating Guskov in the grappling, made him look really out of his element. But Spann, for whatever reason, did not opt to keep pursuing that path to victory and got knocked out in the second round in what was easily the most successful result of Guskov's MMA career. Prior to that, he lost a split decision to Anthony Smith that I believe I've spoken about on here before. I thought it was totally ridiculous when it happened that that fight didn't go Spann's way. I thought it was the UFC kind of doing a bit of a favor to one of the members of their commentary team, trying to give a little bit more of relevancy to somebody that in a very shallow division already has, I guess, a little bit more of, if you want to call it, star potential, at least a bit more of a promo push than Ryan Spann, I guess, despite the fact that Spann is someone that's fought and won on Contender Series and has made 2 appearances. But, for whatever reason, they decided, you know what, Anthony Smith landing 3/4 of all of his significant strikes on low leg kicks is enough to give Spann the decision, in spite of the fact that Spann very nearly should have gotten a doctor's stoppage in that fight in the same way that Moicano just did against Saint Denis. But it is what it is. I had a little bit more success with his 2 fights before that. I took the under on rounds against when he fought Nikita Krylov, thinking, boy, both of these guys have a history of making mistakes in grappling exchanges, and I wonder if that's going to lead to one of them losing this fight very early on. If not, if Spann is the real deal after what happened against Reyes, maybe he ends up sparking Krylov for a knockout, or just either way, based on the early results that Spann has consistently had, I think this is going to go under. And it did. And they got into a very, very interesting series of grappling exchanges where Krylov ultimately caught him in a triangle choke. Fight prior to that was a pick'em in terms of the over-under. And I can't remember. Spann must have been overvalued, but I took the under at plus money. And that was at one of the first events that I started doing the 3 or 4 leg parlays on. It was the UFC 281, and it was also a night I made Moicano a parlay leg, and I believe Andre Petroski versus Wellington Turman was the other one that I did for my 3 legs. So I hit a nice 3 leg parlay with that. There might have been a 4th one in there, I can't recall, but I felt pretty good about Reyes Spann ending in the first half of the fight. And I got into some pretty spirited debates with people about that. And yeah, that fight didn't go 90 seconds, and Reyes got nuked. Now, it ended up biting me in the butt later on because I thought Reyes really didn't have much left when I faded him against Dustin Jacoby earlier this year. And obviously, Reyes got the better of him in that result. But we'll talk more about Dustin Jacoby later. The fight prior to that, one of the things that encouraged me to take the under on the two fights following the first one in which I had to evaluate Spann was when he fought Ion Cutelaba, and Cutelaba was something like a 300 favorite, and I felt good about taking Cutelaba at that price. Oh, man. Another example of a guillotine being the worst enemy of bettors. But, obviously Cutelaba is a fighter prone to his own mistakes. But Spann ended up catching him and won in the first half of the first round of that fight, and ended up getting a pretty nice bounce-back submission win for him that kind of restarted the momentum of his career after losing his first main event to Anthony Smith, the fight prior to that. Ovince St. Preux enters 27-17. Last appeared at Fight Night Tuivasa Tybura in a fight that I advocated people to stay away from. I might have had St. Preux graded to win, but that was another situation where I was just like, there's no way I feel good about him doing it at this age, so I'd rather just advocate to stay away. And he ended up getting the split decision win in what was, in a career that's been full of them, was easily the most underwhelming performance we've seen to date from Kennedy and Nchekwu. Prior to that, St. Preux, I took him as an underdog against Felipe Lins, and he got sparked within 60 seconds. Felipe Lins has been one of the most difficult fighters for me to cap the entire time I've been doing this. I've faded him 3 different times against Marcin Prachnio and Ovince St. Preux, and most recently against Ion Cutelaba, to a lack of success in all 3 results. And I think the one time I faded him when he fought, I picked him to win when he fought, I'm forgetting the name, but he fought some Russian dude. But prior to that, forgive me, I'm going to need to find this. Maxim Grishin, that was who it was. He was favored over Maxim Grishin. I took him to win in that. But getting away from Lins, St. Preux got knocked out by Tanner Boser. But afterwards, at an event I attended UFC 274, fought Mauricio Shogun Rua. I thought, okay, this is probably not going to go how the first fight went between them in, I believe it was 2014, when St. Preux knocked him out inside of a minute. He said, now that these guys this is kind of an old man fight, I bet this goes over 2.5 rounds. And that's exactly what happened. It was interesting because that fight came before, I believe, the Tony Ferguson-Michael Chandler fight, which I've said it before, being there live, it was like a bolt of lightning went through the arena when Chandler soccer kicked Ferguson. But then the fight after that was what many call the worst title fight in UFC history, between Rose Namajunas and Carla Esparza. People were waving the lights around on their phones and everything and talking about how terrible it was. And most people bet Rose is a 2-1 favorite that night too. So nobody was happy after that fight. Thankfully, Charles Oliveira and Justin Gaethje salvaged the evening. But the fight before Ferguson-Chandler, I believe, was Shogun Rua St. Preux. One of the reasons I wanted to go to that card was because, when I first got a little bit of exposure to the UFC in 2009, 2010, Shogun Rua was obviously, one of the, already a legend, but was still had so much more to do in his career. And being he was like kind of one of the first big names I had exposed to, I wanted to see what I thought was going to potentially be his last fight. Was his last fight on American soil. But obviously he ended up getting one more fight against Ihor Potieria and got knocked out in front of his home fans in Brazil and then retired. But the fight against St. Preux and Rua was just as bad as the one between Namajunas and Esparza. People were waving their phones around and actively booing, and I thought St. Preux won the fight. I was kind of surprised it went to a split. I think maybe they were kind of trying to do Rua a favor, but yeah, not really much to gain from that one just because it was a fight between 2 old guys. Now, interestingly enough, a month ago, I was willing to take OSP as a nearly 3-1 underdog. And he's still lined around the same price going into this one. The fact that he pulled out during fight week and has a history of kind of unprompted withdrawals concerns me enough that I've now got like a dead even grade between these two, and I'd rather not pick a side. I would feel much more comfortable now just taking the under on rounds, especially because it was available at plus odds when I put the pick out earlier this week, and has since shrunk to nearly a dead even pick 'em. So I feel vindicated by that line movement. It remains to be seen how I'll feel about playing that. I could see St. Preux extending this out a little bit if Spann isn't on the gas to start. But I do think, based on the fact that St. Preux has suffered 5 knockouts at this point, including that first-minute knockout to Linz, and the fact that Spann does have the kind of power to end a fight in the first couple minutes that we saw against Reyes, that's certainly a possible result here. And I think the market reflects that with how the fight is actually lined. But the other side of this that makes me feel good about the under, that I feel pretty good about seeing, is Spann's most reputable submission is guillotine. And look, again, I've talked about before, I'm no technical maven when it comes to this stuff, but you do pick up on a few things the longer you end up watching fights between people across weight classes at this level. And I do know that if you are sloppy in shooting your guillotines, you can put yourself in a position to accidentally set yourself up for a Von Flue choke or a shoulder choke. And that happens to be Ovince St. Preux's signature submission, enough to the point that some people have taken to calling it the St. Preux choke instead of the Von Flue choke. Spann, one of the reasons he lost to Krylov was because instead of keeping it on the feet, he was too willing to jump the guillotine the way that he did to get his win over Ion Kutalaba. And Krylov was able to get out of that, and they got into a more sophisticated grappling exchange, and Spann made a mistake that put himself in a triangle, and Krylov was able to get the tap out of that. If Ryan Spann shoots a sloppy guillotine in the early stages of this fight against St. Preux, I think we could see something very similar to what happened when Gabriel Bonfim fought on Contender Series. Bonfim got caught in a guillotine, but was able to adjust and get out of it, or without even really his opponent letting go of the choke. He ended up turning the tables on his opponent and locking in a Von Flue choke, and that's how he ended up winning his fight on Contender Series. I think something very similar could happen here, given that that is the setup for these two, given their signature submissions. So I'm going to be taking the under on rounds. If an exchange like that happens, I would expect it to happen in the first half of the fight. The one thing that does make me a little concerned about this bet is that St. Preux has a very curious amount of results in his MMA career where fights have either gone just over or just under the 2.5 minute mark of the second round, including a very interesting streak pretty recently in his career where his fight with Tanner Boser went 2 minutes 31 seconds into the second round before he got knocked out. He got knocked out by Jamal Hill only about a minute and a half, or less than a minute and a half after the 2.5 minute mark of the second round. He knocked out Alonzo Menafield a minute and a half after the 2.5 minute mark of the second round. He submitted Mikhail Oleksiejczuk 16 seconds after the 2.5 minute mark. His fight against Nikita Krylov went exactly 2.5 minutes into the second round. He submitted Marcos Rogerio de Lima, I believe, with the Von Flue choke, 19 seconds before the 2.5 minute mark. He got knocked out by Jimmy Manua in 2016, 8 seconds after the 2.5 minute mark. He knocked out Ryan Jimmo 10 years ago, 20 seconds before the 2.5 minute mark. There's a ton of results in which this guy has just gone barely up to the minute and a half mark. So if this doesn't end in the first round, I'm going to be pretty nervous about it ending before that. But I do think if Spann doesn't end up knocking him out, there's a strong possibility that Spann jumps guillotine, possibly after hurting St. Preux, and St. Preux is able to turn that into a Von Flue choke. So I think this one could go either way. Like I said, I was favoring St. Preux ever so slightly a month ago, just because, or I was picking St. Preux ever so slightly a month ago just because I thought Span's recent history of losing fights, snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, plays directly into how St. Preux can get a pretty obvious path to a win here. But I feel better about hedging on rounds now, given where both guys are kind of at in their careers. So I'll say Span gets a first-round knockout, but it wouldn't shock me at all if St. Preux slaps on the Von Flue choke after a sloppy guillotine. The next fight is Cesar Almeida and Ihor Potieria. Almeida enters 5-1, suffered the first loss of his MMA career in his last appearance against Roman Kopylov at UFC 302 in a fight that was one of the most, I think, heavily contested between cappers the whole year. Both sides were very confident that their side was going to win. People kept talking about Almeida's kickboxing experience. You can go back and watch the UFC 302 episode of the Rex Pod in which I kind of made fun of people talking about, he beat Alex Pereira in kickboxing 10 years ago, so that means he's going to piece up Kopylov. And it's like, that's a different sport. And Kopylov proved that. And Kopylov being a, very, very high-level Sambo practitioner, made it a well-rounded MMA fight and ended up beating Almeida in a fight that really should not have been a split decision. Are you seeing a theme here? There's a lot of fighters with sloppy split decisions that otherwise shouldn't have been on this card. I thought it was pretty clear Kopylov won the first round and the third round, particularly based on the body language that Almeida demonstrated in the third round, where he had an opportunity to get back to his feet and didn't, and Kopylov just ended up pouncing back on the ground and kind of writing the fight out from there. I did think it was 1-1 going into the third, but I thought it was pretty ridiculous that any judge could have scored that fight for Almeida. I also faded him against Dylan Budka in a fight that I talked about the judging a bit in probably the longest post I've ever made on Twitter, where I was just talking about the judging generally coming out of UFC Fight Night Allen versus Curtis too, because there was a lot of discussion about the judging coming out of that event that I thought was pretty fair. A lot of people were upset that Budka unanimously got the first round, even though he had like a shiner under his eye or something that Almeida got from doing like clinch elbow strikes. And it just goes to show you that there's a lot of people that don't really understand what the rules are, because you can't score total strikes. You don't reward damage scored. In most cases, unless it's totally compromising, you don't reward strikes landed from a non-dominant position. And Budka had him in control for nearly the entire first round. It remains to be seen if other fighters will be able to do that to him, although Kopylov certainly did so in a way that we hadn't really seen Kopylov do in a lot of his other earlier fights. Prior to that, went the distance for the first time in MMA on Contender Series and got a unanimous decision and a contract. Conversely, Potieria enters 20-6, got finished in the first minute by Michel Pereira at UFC 301. In one of the more hilarious results of the year, in which Pereira, I believe, dropped Potieria and then backflipped onto him and slapped on a submission shortly afterwards. I advocated for staying away from that one just because I thought Pereira was overvalued. Pereira is a fighter that I believe I've only backed him against Santiago Ponzinibbio, so I've been pretty consistently against playing him. But I advocated for staying away from a lot of wide lines on that card, and I was at least right in the fight relative to Vitor Petrino and Anthony Smith. But in that case, Pereira did perform to price. Potieria got a unanimous decision over Robert Brycek the fight prior to that. He hadn't won since his kind of a setup spot as a 2-1 favorite over Shogun Rua at UFC 283. Got knocked out by Rodolfo Bellato and Carlos Ulberg in the two results between those. I don't really have too much to say about this one, so I will try to make it quick. I'm on 3 different unders on this card. I think that unders are going to be the better way to go here. For a lot of these fights, I know there's the meme about the gloves leading to less knockouts and whatever, but I feel like there's a lot of people with questionable chins, if you will, that are fighting on this card. And I think that, even though people are talking about how elevation is a factor here, and it probably won't be as much of a factor as it is in a place like Denver, I've seen too many Utah events where cardio is factored heavily into the result for me to think that it's not going to more gradually tire out fighters that aren't really equipped to deal with fighting at that elevation. The most outrageous example I can think of in terms of a previous Utah card was when Alexander Romanov fought Marcin Tybura and should have gotten a 10-8 in the first round, and which would have made the fight a draw, but totally depleted his gas tank doing so, and Tybura was able to clean him up the last 10 minutes and get a 29-28 massive upset win. But I do think that it's going to be more difficult to take fights going the distance given the potential for fighters to get tired on this card, which will factor into why I'm staying off of the fight that I'm going to talk about after this. But in any event, relative to this one, it's interesting trying to one of the most difficult things to evaluate, I think, which is unfortunate because it's arguably the most significant factor in grading fighters after age, is their potential to get one punch lights out knockouts. I'm sure I've spoken about it on this podcast before, but typically what I will do is I'll evaluate all the results in their MMA career, see if there's at least one, and then try to go review the regional footage or at least the record of the opponent to see if it was legitimate or not. But in most cases where there's a bit of doubt, I end up giving the fighter the benefit of the doubt just because this is high-level MMA. Usually more so for the heavier weight classes. I always give the benefit of the doubt to the heavyweights, even if they are traditionally more decision machines. But in this case, it's interesting with Almeida and Potieria because the guy that Almeida knocked out, Danilo de Souza Silva, in his fight before he got to the UFC, I think got knocked out in about 2 or 3 fights after he fought Almeida as well. And he has like 17, he's like 5-28 in his MMA career and has like 17 knockout losses on his record. So he'd already been knocked out like 14 times before he fought Almeida. And that's really the only result we have of Almeida knocking out a fighter with one punch. But I still am giving Almeida the benefit of the doubt that he has that kind of power. And then conversely with Potieria, the one result that we have in his career, which, has a highly interesting record given it coming out of Ukraine, and some of the promotions he fought in, I think, were even outdoor octagons that had like rain on their canvas and stuff. His result against Alexander Pushkar in the third fight of his MMA career, Potieria, the guy that he fought, that guy fought in that one instance and then has no other MMA appearances after that. So I don't ever like saying like, oh, these guys are fighting plumbers or, or whatever, like a lot of people do in terms of trying to degrade lower level competition. But that was a case where it was like, all right, this guy's clearly not, doing the sport in a competitive capacity, because that was his only appearance, and Potieria put him out in less than 90 seconds. Now, what's interesting is the fight before that, Potiera's second career appearance, which was also at light heavyweight, he got knocked out in 2.5 minutes in the second fight of his MMA career against a guy named Evgeny Vyatoka. That was back in 2015. And he's been knocked out 3 other times since then in the UFC. One was more of an attrition-based knockout to Nikolai Negumereanu in a fight that I took the over 2.5 in, which I thought was silly. The fight after that against Shogun Rua, I took the minus, I think it was a minus 2.5, and got pretty vindicated by Rua getting knocked out in the last minute of that fight. Against Ulberg was a massive favorite. I took the under in that one. Potieria got knocked out inside of 2.5 minutes. Rodolfo Bellato, I think I might have said stay away, but Bellato, in a fight that was more competitive than I think people were expecting, Potieria still ended up taking too much damage in the second round and getting finished. Potieria was a massive underdog against Brycek. I advocated staying away in that case. Also because Brycek hadn't fought in the UFC before, so I just don't bet on debutantes generally. But he ended up getting the decision in that case, even though Brycek had a slew of one-punch knockouts in his own right before he joined the UFC. And then Michel Pereira, I advocated staying away, and Potieria knocked him out in less than a minute. Now, the interesting thing about the Brycek fight, I believe that wasn't his Potiera's MMA debut at middleweight, but it was his UFC debut at middleweight. I believe that he might have been taking that as a late replacement, and he did end up missing weight. But he did make weight when he fought Michel Pereira. He might have been a replacement for that fight too. I can't recall, but he did end up making weight for the Pereira fight. So he did get down to 185, and he got finished inside of a minute. The fact that he's been knocked out multiple times at 205 pounds and has now moved down to 185 pounds makes me highly suspect of his damage tolerance. And that's really the biggest reason why I think Almeida is probably going to finish this fight inside of a round and a half. More than, as I alluded to earlier, I think in terms of the true power that Almeida's got, it's still a little bit suspect given that, or at least just relative to one-punch knockouts. I don't know if he's going to put Potieria out that badly. I don't know if Potieria really has the potential to do that to anybody based on, like I said, that knockout he got in the third fight of his MMA career. But as I said, at this level, I'm willing to usually give them the benefit of the doubt. So I have in this case, and Almeida did get dropped against Kopylov in the first round of their fight, but he did end up recovering and, avoided getting finished against a guy in Kopylov who's usually pretty lethal, even though he doesn't. I think he's got maybe one first-round finish in his entire MMA career. In any event, I expect Almeida to get a first-round knockout. I have to highly question Potiera's move to middleweight, just given the fact that he had been knocked out and taking 20 pounds off of his chin, 10% of his body weight for most of his MMA career, I don't think is going to pay dividends for him. And we already saw how it could come back to bite him against an opponent like Michel Pereira. I think this is going to be the second straight fight in which Potieria gets finished by a Brazilian in the first round. So give me Cesar Almeida by first round knockout. The next fight is Alexander Hernandez and Austin Hubbard. Hernandez enters 14-8. Most recently lost a split decision to Damon Jackson at Fight Night Allen versus Curtis 2 in a fight that I picked Jackson to win as the underdog and was vindicated in that choice. By the way, as the day I'm recording this is the day after Alexander Hernandez's birthday. So happy 32nd birthday to the great ape. Belated at this point. In any event, lost a decision to Bill Algeo in a fight that I think he was the slightest of underdogs. Like I said, I think on the last episode, Algeo is just an incredibly frustrating fighter to cap generally, and that was another great example. Jim Miller, Hernandez did beat him by unanimous decision, but it got really, really close. I think Miller nearly submitted him at the end of their fight in that case, but Hernandez, it was a nice bounce back result for him after getting knocked out by Billy Quarantillo at UFC 282. And the week before I started doing the analysis for MMA Racks at UFC 271, he was submitted by Renato Moicano. So he is 1-4 in his last 5, but still comes into this a pretty healthy favorite. His price has come down a little bit, but he's still favored over Austin Hubbard, who, as I alluded to earlier in this episode, got a decision over Michael Figlak that many felt he did not deserve in his last fight at Nicolau Perez at the end of April. I thought that he won, but again, I am biased, and I'm willing to at least entertain the fact that you could definitely score that fight for Figlak. One of the reasons I picked Hubbard in that case as an underdog was because I thought Hubbard, as someone who had recently competed in the Ultimate Fighter finale, had a bit more of a promo push than this guy in Figlak, who at that point I don't believe had fought since he hadn't competed since September, the UFC Paris event that was in September of 2022. So with only one previous UFC appearance, I thought, this is a guy the UFC will probably be willing to throw under the bus in order to prop up one of their recent faces on Tough that very nearly won the Ultimate Fighter finale and ultimately did not. Hollabaugh won, but Hubbard did win the first round of that fight. Hollabaugh just kind of came out guns blazing in the second round and was able to catch Hubbard off guard and ultimately get him in a submission. The third submission loss of Hubbard's MMA career, although he's never been knocked out. I'm staying away from this one. I thought I was going to pick Hubbard at first, but I wanted to pick Hernandez, but I am, although there's some people that are saying they're kind of all the way out, I am just worried about, again, with the elevation here in Utah. And I do think Hernandez's cardio allegations are a little bit overblown. He's got a pretty good history of winning fights that go the distance, in spite of the fact that he's got 2 straight decision losses, even though one of them was a split. But he otherwise, in the 10 fights of his career that have gone the distance, he's won most of them. Now, granted, he's 1-3 in his last 4 decisions, but prior to that, the only other decision in his MMA career he had lost prior to his fight with Thiago Moises was a split decision to Jamal Emmers in his 3rd career MMA fight. I am encouraged by the fact that he's moving back to lightweight. I thought that him, trying to make 145 was already kind of crazy, and I believe he did miss weight for the Damon Jackson fight. But I again, the risk here now is, with people already being concerned about his cardio, him adding 10 pounds back onto his body, how is that going to affect his cardio in, when he's used to competing at a lower weight, or at least making a heavier cut or a larger cut? His most recent performances, having the extra weight back on now at a higher elevation, how is that going to affect him? It's not as extreme of a change as dropping the 20 pounds from light heavyweight to middleweight, as I just discussed in the case of Ihor Potieria, but it gives me caution here in terms of anyone wanting to bet Hernandez, particularly at this price. And it looks like now that some money has come in on Hubbard to kind of shrink Hernandez's price tag a bit. Now, the flip side is Hubbard, who consistently drags fights out to a decision. He's got a little bit more experience going the distance, but he's about as consistently of a late round performer as Hernandez is, but without the cardio allegations. And Hubbard has never been knocked out. So I would be surprised if Hernandez is, of the fighters that Hubbard has faced, if Hernandez is going to be the first guy to really do that to him. Although I don't think, even looking at the UFC fighters that Hubbard has faced, if he's really faced any nuclear hitters to begin with. Certainly not Marco Madsen or Joe Selecki or Dakota Bush or Vink Pichel or, Michael Figlak might have been the best striker he's faced, honestly, this last performance. Roosevelt Roberts, I think, conducted himself well against Ludovic Klein last week. But that was another fight, too, watching that. I was kind of surprised that Hubbard got the split decision there. I thought that really should have gone Roberts' way. I was surprised they didn't, especially given the frame and everything. I thought Roberts kind of had better potential than Hubbard did in terms of if he were to win Ultimate Fighter, becoming a more household name. But in any event, he's got a pretty good history going the distance himself, and he'll probably end up dragging this out. It made me want to bet the plus 2.5, but it's pretty heavily juiced. It's like minus 210 and has held at that all week. And I'm just worried about, given the cardio history with Hernandez and the fact that this is at elevation. I don't necessarily expect Hubbard to get a finish, because his only finish in his UFC career was a doctor stoppage against Max Roskopf in his first UFC run. But there's enough concern here based on I've seen Hernandez just kind of fade in less elevated circumstances, that if he kind of overexerts himself, wins the first round, and then Hubbard, given the style of fight that he likes to do, where he just gradually builds and comes back and makes things messy and dirty's the wrong word. But he is definitely more of a grinder. I'm worried about how, if his cardio holds up and Hernandez's doesn't, I'm worried about Hernandez making it to the last 2.5 minutes of this fight. So I would just stay off this one. Don't bet this. I would expect Hernandez to probably get a split decision here. But it wouldn't surprise me if, again, given the favorable judging history we've seen towards Hubbard, if the UFC again throws this guy a bone in terms of trying to prop him up, and they've already decided at this point we're out on Hernandez, as many people in the betting market have already vocalized themselves as being this week. I would just stay off this one and let the result play out. The next fight is Joaquin Buckley and Stephen Thompson. Buckley enters 19-6. Most recently got a unanimous decision win over Nursultan Ruziboyev at Fight Night Louis Nascimento, which I believe was a hometown fight for Buckley in St. Louis. Prior to that, in another very contentious fight between capping sides earlier this year at Fight Night Blanchfield Fioro, which I believe was Fight Night Atlantic City, he knocked out Vicente Luque in the second round of a fight that I can't recall if Buckley got two judges to give him the first round in that one, but I remember it wasn't unanimous, that Luque either got one or two of the judges that scored that first round for him. So it was a closer fight than people remember through the first round, but it was very discouraging to see a guy like Luque, who had beaten several higher level opponents than Buckley to that point, kind of fade and keel over and quit in a way that we weren't really familiar with seeing him doing. I faded Buckley in both of those cases. I also faded him against Alex Morono in a fight that he pretty handily won. And I can't recall if I faded him against Andre Fiallo, but it's very possible that I did. So the first time that I ever, it's interesting. No, it was the week before I started doing the analysis that he fought Abdul Razak Al Hassan to a split decision. But I did take Buckley as an underdog against Albert Duraev in a fight that he won by doctor stoppage. That was at Fight Night Qatar M, at one of the first events that I did publicly on this account. But I've faded Buckley in every spot since then, I think, with the possible exception of the Fiallo fight, which might have been a stay away. But I think I might have even taken Fiallo as an underdog there. I did fade him against Nasruddin Imavov, and I did fade him against Chris Curtis, a fight he was favored to win, and Curtis knocked him out in the second round. So I haven't really been super impressed by Buckley for most of his UFC career, which is why the heaps of praise he was getting in his fights earlier this year kind of shocked me and prompted me to bet his opponents. He ended up conducting himself very well, I think, I was more impressed by the Ruziboyev victory than I was against Luque. I was more discouraged by Luque than I was impressed with Buckley in that case. The thing that still concerns me about Buckley is that he really, really, is not an accurate striker in any sense, in spite of the fact that he does have a positive striking differential for his career. His defense is okay, but the fact that he's such an inaccurate hitter, barely landing more than 1 in 3 of his attempts, is going to set him up a lot of the times to get countered, which I think would have made him very right bait for an opponent like Stephen Thompson if Thompson was earlier in his career. Thompson himself enters 17-17-1, most recently at UFC 296 at the end of last year. Got submitted by Shavkat Rakhmonov at the end of the second round. Prior to that, in what was one of the best fights of 2022, had a comeback knockout win over Kevin Holland after getting hurt pretty badly in the first round. There was an unspoken agreement between the two that they wouldn't really wrestle. Holland incredibly foolishly let Thompson back to his feet in spite of the fact that Holland, I believe, claimed that he broke his hand not checking the kicks from Thompson in that fight, but actually when he nearly got the knockdown on Thompson, I believe that was when he said he broke his hand, and then him having to gradually check kicks throughout the rest of the fight gradually just made the damage even worse, to the point where he said just cut the gloves off, and the doctor stopped the fight at the end of the fourth round. Still a comeback win for Thompson. One of the best performances you're ever going to see from a fighter 39 years or older. And it was a joy, even though I ended up having a losing night, I believe, because of that result. It was a joy to watch that at the end of the year. I think we had one more fight night after that, which was the infamous Strickland Cannonier fight that was like the weirdest fight to judge that anyone's ever seen. But the main event the week before that was one of the best of the year. Absolutely spectacular, phenomenal fight. It was crazy to see Holland remark in the middle of the fight on how fast he was seeing Stephen Thompson as, and that his speed hadn't really dropped off in spite of his age. So you wonder how much of that is going to hold up here, particularly given how his fight against Rakhmonov went. Prior to that, Thompson lost unanimous decisions to Bilal Muhammad and Gilbert Burns, but he did beat Jeff Neal and Vicente Luque in two events prior to that. The fight against Neal being a pretty dominant unanimous decision win that was the main event back in 2020, almost exactly 2 years before his win against Holland, and what was his only main event since. This is pretty much a pure fade on age here, because it's like I said, I really don't like a lot of what I've seen from Buckley in terms of striking, and if Thompson was a little bit younger here, I think that, like, if age wasn't a factor here, I would probably pick Thompson to win. I do think that Buckley, being in his prime and having shown a little bit of well-rounded improvements in his recent appearances, if Buckley wrestles here, I think he's going to have this pretty handily in the bag. What I'm more concerned with is how much damage is Thompson going to be able to do if in the earlier stages of this fight, Buckley doesn't opt to put it on the ground right away, which I kind of think is what's going to happen. I think Buckley's probably going to want to show off a little bit more on the feet, and is probably going to get countered pretty badly in the early stages of the fight. It's possible he ends up even losing the first round for it, but I think that ultimately as the fight goes on, Buckley's going to recognize that, okay, I'm on a 4-fight win streak. I don't want to give up the momentum I have at welterweight. I need to just fight my most effective path to victory. And it's not like Thompson has super ironclad takedown defense. It's only slightly above average at 65%. And Buckley, I was a little bit worried about his willingness to wrestle against Ruziboyev, but that ended up being the main reason why he ended up taking that win. So I do think that Buckley, just being the fact that he's over a decade younger, is going to be able to pretty easily implement that game plan, and it's been an obvious flaw in Thompson's skill set that he's been able to overcome at earlier stages of his career. But the reality is the guy's over 40 at this point, and I think one of the interesting trends that I've noticed, just not in any truly statistically significant sense, statistically significant sense that I've heavily I can't speak right now, heavily dived into, I don't even know if that's the right word. Forgive me. Point is, I haven't looked at it on a truly long-term context, but just kind of like thinking in terms of everything that I've seen. I've noticed that there's usually a pretty good you have to recognize when the right time is to get off the train for a fighter that you've got a very high opinion of that's starting to get older in their career. To that point, I didn't do it in time with Luque, but Luque is also still young enough that you're kind of surprised that the fall off has been as extreme as it is, given I don't even necessarily think he's out of his prime ages yet. He's probably starting to get close to the decline, but age was one of the reasons that I picked him over Rafael dos Anjos. There's another older fighter on this card that had some success recently that I'm going to be backing the favorite against that I'll get into, again, a bit later when I talk about that fight. But I think that there's a lot of people that are longtime fans of this sport that, they bet on these older fighters thinking that they're going to see vintage performances. And even though we've seen that out of Thompson at 39 years old, just think about how differently that fight could have gone if Holland didn't end up breaking his hand, nearly finishing it in the first round. Furthermore, if Holland actually opted to wrestle even after breaking his hand, because he did take Thompson down at one point but just led him back to his feet, how differently would the result have been? I really have to believe here that, we've already seen the best of Stephen Thompson, and that, the Shavkat Rakhmonov fight has kind of cemented the fact that this guy's probably not going to be in a position to go for a title shot or even a main event again at this stage of his career. I do think based on the momentum that Buckley has, that the UFC is kind of trying to give him a little bit of a push, and that he's always going to have, a favorable view from the UFC in terms of star potential, just because he has one of the best knockouts in MMA history over Impa Kasanage, who has since gone on, obviously, to PFL success. So if the UFC can prop up that, this guy knocked out, PFL's champion, they obviously would like to put themselves further over in terms of propping up a guy that they can kind of hold out there as, this is just another guy for us at welterweight, and, he knocked out that badly the best guy that other promotion has. So I do think there's a bit of a push lately to kind of get Buckley some positive momentum back in his career after he lost those fights to Imavov and Curtis. And I think this is just the next stage of that. I don't want to call it a passing of the torch moment, because I don't know if Buckley's ever going to realistically be a title contender the way that Thompson is. But I do think at this stage, it's probably time for Stephen Thompson to, be about done, even though obviously the guy is one of the most entertaining strikers we've seen. So Buckley's a 2-1 favorite here. He's gotten a little bit more expensive the further I've put out the pick. I put him out minus 200. He's now 220. But I do think he's playable in that 200 range. If he somehow gets out to like minus 300 before fight day, I wouldn't recommend betting him at that rate, just because I'm still really, really concerned about the accuracy in the offensive striking. But if Buckley just opts to put this on the ground, this is his fight to lose, given the age gap between these two. So give me Buckley to win a 30-27 decision, but it wouldn't surprise me if he ends up dropping the first round, because he's too willing to entertain Thompson on the feet, and Thompson's able to counter him in a way that leaves Buckley, if not somewhat compromised, at least gets his attention as like, okay, I don't want to hang out here for the rest of the time I have to be in the cage with this guy. The first fight on the main card of UFC 307 is Kevin Holland and Roman Dolidze. Holland enters 26-11 after getting a first-round submission at UFC 302 over Mikhail Oleksiejczuk. Prior to that, he lost at UFC 299 at the pay-per-view in Miami. When I was still in Miami, I opted not to go because I didn't think it was going to be better than UFC 287. I felt pretty vindicated in that decision. He lost to Michael Page in Page's own UFC debut. Prior to that, he lost a split decision to Jack Della Maddalena that I would have liked to see go Holland's way, but I can see how you would have scored it for either fighter. Della Maddalena bettors will insist that that fight shouldn't have been a split decision, and I very much disagree with that read. But in any event, Holland was a closer favorite than expected when he fought Michael Chiesa. The fight before that, I picked Holland. I made Holland a parlay leg. That was at UFC 291. And Holland won that by submission within the first 3 minutes. Prior to that, I saw Holland fight against Santiago Ponzinibbio at UFC 287, and I should have made him a parlay leg that night instead of Raul Rosas Jr. I believe he was at a very similar price to Rosas Jr., but what deterred me from doing that was the concerns about fight IQ facing someone like Stephen Thompson, who he had faced in the fight prior to that and lost in the ways that I just talked about in the last breakdown relative to Wonder Boy. Got reshuffled, rebooked against Khamzat Chimaev, and I took the over in that one, the over 1.5 rounds, and I could tell very quickly based on Chimaev what he wanted to do. I was like, oh, this is not going to end well. He's just going to get ragdolled. And then against Tim Means, I advocated staying away from that fight, and yeah, he got a submission in that one. One of the first pay-per-view that I ever did the grading analysis on, UFC 272. I took another over 1.5 on Holland, and felt pretty good about it through the first round, especially given Oliveira was able to end the round in a guillotine. That was that famous picture of Holland where he's given the double thumbs up. Was the end of that first round, and then within the next 40 seconds of the second round, he was able to get the knockout on Cowboy Oliveira. So he's had a very tumultuous career, although he is 5-4 over his last 9 now. And obviously, there's a lot of people that don't feel encouraged by him moving back to middleweight, me included, just given how his first stint went when he got, a couple different high-level main events against very accomplished middleweight fighters. Lost pretty dominant decisions to Derek Brunson, Marvin Vettori, and a lot of people that are betting the underdog this week, Roman Dolidze, think that this fight is going to go similarly to how those went. Dolidze enters 13-3. Most recently won a unanimous decision over Anthony Smith at UFC 303. I made him a parlay leg at that event. That was one of my most profitable events of the year. I felt very good about that fight based on the fact that Dolidze had never been finished and Smith had been finished 15 times. And Dolidze did knock him down, I think, at one point in the second round, and probably should have gotten a 30-27. I think at least one of the judges gave him a 29-28 just for kind of coasting the final round after he was pretty confident he banked the first two. Prior to that, lost a majority decision to Nasruddin Imavov in a fight that wasn't particularly close. Should have been a unanimous decision for Imavov. One of the judges curiously gave the second round of that fight to Dolidze, even though really Dolidze wasn't doing a lot of significant damage in that fight. All 4 of his takedown attempts got stuffed. He was really just kind of holding on the fence and not doing a lot of significant striking damage. And the judge in that case, still in what was probably the closest round between the two of them, round 2, gave that round to Dolidze, and then gave the 4th round to Dolidze, which I think is the round that most people scored the fight most favorably for Dolidze, for the other judges that I think had it 49-46, in addition to the point deduction that Imavov had that round, which had that infamous exchange between Imavov doing the illegal knee. It was a knee or a kick while Dolidze had his hands on the ground. That rule's obviously going away in a month. The corner of Dolidze, Extreme Couture, which included Chris Curtis, there was bad blood there. The two of them kind of going at each other. And then, Herb having to step in and drag Imavov back, or push Imavov back to his corner and tell him, I will disqualify you. I will disqualify you. Even though Imavov doesn't really speak English, so I don't know how well that he I don't know how well that he actually understood that. Although DC alleged in the post-fight interview that he was, when Imavov called for the translator, DC was like, "Man, you did your whole media day in English. Why do you need a translator now?" But in any event, Dolidze lost a unanimous decision to Marvin Vettori at UFC 286 in his fight before that. Had an incredible 2022 prior to that, where he got 3 straight knockout wins. Tore Phil Hawes's ACL, I believe, and then got one of the craziest, like, he had Jack Hermanson in a calf slicer, and then just kind of put him in a position where he wasn't really able to defend strikes and just beat him out on the ground. So Dolidze's a menace on the ground. There's no question about it. But Holland is coming off of his 5th submission win, and I think that you can very easily make the argument that Holland is just as much of a threat offensively on the ground as Dolidze is. Dolidze is not the only person that's gotten a knockout win from a bizarre angle on the ground in this matchup. If you'll recall, Kevin Holland's knockout against Jacare Souza was one of the most absurd you'll see. Granted, Souza had encountered more damage at that point than Dolidze, but Dolidze also got hurt very badly in his fight against Imavov to the point that many people were calling for a 10-8 round. So I think actually instead of 49-46, it was 49-45 on a lot of cards in that. But it was a majority decision because that one judge scored it 47-47 without giving Imavov a 10-8 in the first round, and it was just very, very bizarre that that was the case because Dolidze almost got put out pretty bad by Imavov, a guy that hasn't necessarily demonstrated one-punch lights-out power the same way that Kevin Holland has. So I said it on Twitter, this fight really comes down to who do you trust to do less dumb shit? And I already spoke about how Holland has put himself in compromising situations before from not fighting the most effective path to victory. I can't imagine that there's going to be that sort of gentleman's agreement here between him and Dolidze. And if there is a gentleman's agreement for them to not go to the ground, I think that that's very, very going to heavily favor Holland. And to that point, you know, I see most people that are just looking at those 2 previous results at middleweight that Dolidze has had, and I would just counter that by saying Dolidze's landed 1 takedown in the last 6 fights. Now, he attempted 4 of them against Imavov. I believe he attempted 3 against Vettori, and he got stuffed in all of those cases. And I do believe that Holland has slightly below average takedown defense at 54%. Still not nearly as bad as Dolidze's at 33%, but I don't expect Holland to shoot here. I think that he recognizes that given the 5-inch reach advantage he has, the fact that he's a more accurate hitter at a higher volume, it's definitely going to benefit him more to just keep this on the feet and try to outstrike Dolidze for 15 minutes. He's got almost twice as much experience going the distance, but obviously Holland has not really had a lot of success in fights that have gone the distance previously. So I might be a little bit, or at least fighting in the final round of those fights. So I might be a little bit worried if this fight does, if Holland isn't able to bank the first 2 rounds. But what I really expect to happen here is, just given Dolidze, the takedown rate isn't nearly as high as what you would want for someone that you are, a lot of people betting him as an underdog this week are pretty firmly convinced that, he's just going to take Holland down on the ground and dominate him. Holland is just as much of an excellent submission practitioner as Dolidze is. I don't know if he's going to be able to get up back to his feet, particularly just because Dolidze is strong enough that he's fought and won up at light heavyweight before. But I do think that Holland is going to easily win the moments on the feet. And in the same way that you can criticize Holland not pursuing his best path to victory previously, you can make the very same argument for Dolidze. And my guess is that Dolidze is not going to put this fight on the ground until it's already too late for him. I think he's going to be too willing to entertain Holland on the feet in the same way that he was against Vettori in the early part of their fight. And I think even though Dolidze, I would expect him to win the final round of this, I think this is going to come down to which guy ends up winning the second round. And I'll say that Holland is able to keep this fight on the feet long enough in the first 10 minutes and mitigate any control that Dolidze might be able to get on the fence or perhaps bringing it to the ground in the second round, that Holland ends up getting the close decision win here. So I'm going to say Holland wins a 29-28 decision in which he gets the first 10 minutes. But I wish that it was a better price than it is. It is still pretty close. I put it out on Tuesday at -161. He's since dropped to -142. There's a lot of people surprised that Dolidze is in favor to win this, and I can understand why. But I think people are too willing to overlook, just because Holland has more of the higher level rep for not pursuing his best path to victory. The very same can be argued for Dolidze entertaining way too many fights on the feet in situations where you would think he would otherwise be the totally dominant fighter on the ground. Even the fights against Phil Hawes and Hermansson, where he ended up winning the fight because of exchanges that happened on the ground, he wasn't the one to bring them to the ground. He didn't shoot any takedowns against Jack Hermansson, and Phil Hawes put him on the ground before he was able to get a sweep. I can't imagine that Holland is going to be the one to initiate the grappling here and is going to recognize what his most effective path to winning is. And so that's why I think that Holland is probably going to get a 29-28. But like I said, I would expect Dolidze to win the last round of this. I think Holland is going to get the first round just because Dolidze is not going to shoot early enough. What this is going to come down to is how quickly does Dolidze realize that he needs to start feverishly trying to put this on the floor. And I think it's going to be too late by the time that he is able to do so to where he ends up getting the win. So give me Kevin Holland by 29-28 decision. The featured bout at UFC 307 is Mario Batista and Jose Aldo. Batista enters 14-2, most recently fought one time earlier this year at the first event of the year for the UFC, Ankalaev versus Walker 2 back in mid-January, where Batista, as an underdog, got a very dominant unanimous decision win over Ricky Simón, as Simón has kind of continued the descent in his own career. Prior to that, fought Damone Blackshear at UFC 292, got a unanimous decision in that fight. A lot of people, mostly people that bet Blackshear, were surprised it wasn't at least a split. Some people were advocating for Blackshear to win. I thought it was pretty handily at least a 29-28 for Batista. And not just because I made him a parlay leg that night on what was one of my best events of last year. Prior to that, had 3 straight first-round submissions over Guido Canetti, Benito Lopez, and Brian Kelleher. Against Kelleher, I advocated staying away, but against Lopez and Canetti, I took the under in both of those cases and was vindicated in picking those two. So it killed me to fade that the numbers told me to take Ricky Simón as the favorite, because Batista, I think, one of my favorite fighters I've evaluated since I started doing this, just in terms of seeing not only the well-roundedness, but the effectiveness in all areas of MMA, even before he had the result against Kelleher. Really the only concern that you have with this guy is where his chin is at, given he did get knocked out by Trevin Jones. But Jones, had a rep for being a guy who was a nuclear hitter, even if that was really the only weapon that he had. And that's clearly been the best result of Jones's MMA career. So I think he's bounced back well since then with 6 wins. The only other loss he has on his record was his UFC debut, in which he got submitted by Corey Sandhagen. So no shame in that loss. And got a knockout win over Miles Johns, a win that I think has aged considerably well since, and might arguably be the most impressive result that he has on his record now at this stage. Conversely, Jose Aldo, 32-8, had retired after losing to Merab Dvalishvili at UFC 278. I think did a boxing match against, I can't recall who it was. I want to say Johnny Hendricks, but I don't know if that guy was a bantamweight or a featherweight. Where I think he won a very close decision, but there were a lot of people coming out of that were saying like he looked slower or what have you. Was an underdog when he made his return to the UFC against Jonathan Martinez at UFC 301. The King of Rio made the most of the Rio setting and got a pretty dominant unanimous decision win. That was the one, I believe that might have been the only pick. No, it might have been the only pick I missed at that event. I remember feeling really good about the fact that I didn't bet that. No, yeah, that's right. Elsbrenner fought Orolabai, and I took Brenner as an underdog, so I missed that one too. But that pick and Martinez over Aldo were the only two picks that I missed at that event. And thankfully, in the case of the Martinez pick, I only had that in the moonshot because I was worried about Aldo potentially coming back, particularly in the post-USADA era, and looking a few years younger, which he did. And he fed off the Rio environment too, which he's not going to have in this one. So I'm more confident in Batista than I was again with Martinez. Martinez obviously ended up looking pretty starstruck. And I don't think that that's going to be the case twice in a row here now that this is happening in Utah. I know that Aldo's obviously overcome age pretty recently, so that's not the only reason I feel good about Batista. But I do think that if this fight ends up hitting the floor for whatever reason, but I think what the previous fight exposed was that Martinez is a little bit too reliant on kicks, and definitely I don't think has the well-rounded threat here that Batista deploys, because Martinez really didn't look for takedowns at all in that fight, and that let Aldo just kind of tee off without fear. And even though Aldo's obviously, people like to say he's got legendary takedown defense, and he stuffed every attempt that Merab had, even though Merab pinned him on the fence for basically their entire fight. Batista, at least I think, is a credible enough takedown and submission threat that Aldo's going to have to respect that more in the striking here than what he had to deal with against Martinez. And I think Batista's demonstrated to be a more well-rounded striker on the feet than Martinez as well. So Aldo not having to worry about more things as opposed to just, checking leg kicks and then kind of shutting down Martinez from there. There's more threats here that Batista offers than I think Aldo had to deal with in his most recent performance. And he's not going to have the momentum of, the big rush of coming home to his home environment where he's beloved and has had some of the biggest moments in his MMA career. This is a much more neutral setting. I think I heard on another show this week, I believe it was the Sherdog preview, that Batista's only got to make he could drive to this event if he wanted to. It's only about 10 hours from where he's training in Arizona, which is at the MMA lab with Sean O'Malley and Jared Cannonier and other fighters, a gym that had a really, really great year last year. And I think, in spite of the most recent result for O'Malley, I think you can still make a case as one of the best gyms to be training at right now. So Batista's never lost going the distance. I would imagine this one's going to go the distance. Aldo's got 3 times as much experience going the distance over that amount, but he's also coming into this with 2 times as much attrition, and he is 38 years old. I don't necessarily expect Batista to put this fight on the ground, but I do think that he's going to do enough work and stay busy enough on the feet that, Aldo coming up to a higher elevation even though his cardio is held up reasonably fine, I mean, it's not like this is a guy that's never lost going the distance himself. Lost a split decision to Marlon Moraes, lost to Volkanovski. Prior to those two, though, he had never lost a decision in his MMA career, which is extremely impressive. But yeah, I mean, this is a guy who's 4-3 in his last 3 decisions since 2019. Now, again, Volkanovski, Moraes, Merab, those are obviously 3 names that are, at least at this stage, a higher pedigree than Batista. But Batista is someone that I've had my eye on since I started doing this for about 2 years, in terms of, even at a division this deep, I'm so impressed with the aggression that this guy has in all areas of the octagon, that it really just comes down to, can he avoid getting sparked in the same way that he did against Trevin Jones. And he's not going to have to worry about the submission threat here from Aldo, who hasn't won a fight by submission since his 3rd MMA appearance in 2005, in the same way that Batista had to deal with that against Sandhagen. So I'll say Batista gets a 29-28. I don't think it's going to be a blowout. I think Aldo's probably going to show, in the same way that he did against Martinez, that he's still got more left in the tank. But I think a lot of that result had to do with Aldo leaving Batista, or Martinez rather, starstruck in that Rio environment. You have to wonder if that fight had happened in a place like Las Vegas. Obviously, Aldo would have gotten a big reception as an MMA legend in general, but if the King of Rio wasn't fighting in Rio, do you really think he would have had that much of an impact on leaving Martinez as gun-shy as he did? So I expect a better performance from Batista, a more aggressive performance from Batista than what Martinez demonstrated. And age is the most significant variable in this game. And even though Aldo's not 10 years older than Batista, 7 is pretty significant, and Batista's in his prime at this point. And I don't think you can deny that Aldo's in the decline stage of his career at the very least. So give me Batista to win a 29-28 decision in what's a very competitive, probably going to be the fight of the night candidate, I would imagine. And now we come to the main event. Alex Pereira and Khalil Roundtree Jr. Pereira enters 11-2, got one of the best knockouts of the year over Yuri Prochazka at UFC 303, made him a parlay leg, thinking he wasn't going to lose to Prochazka after already beating him once. That was the correct read. Helped make that one of my most profitable events of the year. Made him a parlay leg the fight before that at UFC 300 against Jamal Hill. He won that fight very handily as well, was the first person to really get an outright knockout on Hill, if you don't count that armbar no tap that Paul Craig put him in. And the fight before that, the first fight against Prochazka, arguably lost the first round, but was able to come back and get some really hard elbows on him in the clinch that knocked down Prochazka, and then was able to finish the fight on the ground, even though some people would argue that was an early stoppage. But the fight before that, UFC 291, was a bit of a tilting result for me, because I had Jan Blachowicz as a parlay leg that night, and Jan did not lose that fight. That was, I think, one of the most obvious examples of promo push that you can remember. Because at that point, I believe Izzy was still, because that fight happened in late July of last year. Izzy was still champion, and it was going to be another month plus before he would end up losing the title to Sean Strickland. At that point, the only way that the UFC was going to make another fight between Adesanya and Pereira, which would have completed the UFC trilogy and been probably one of the biggest fights ever from a rivalry perspective that the promotion has had, certainly one of the greatest combat sports rivalry ever if you go back to their fights in kickboxing. They would have needed Pereira to be light heavyweight champion and for Adesanya to be middleweight champion, and then at that point you can have them fight for Pereira's belt at 205. But you can't do that if you don't get him past Jan. And I thought Jan took him down enough and controlled that fight enough that he should have gotten a 29-28. I thought it was a pretty bad robbery, and just because of the star potential that Pereira had, I think that's pretty transparently why he got the decision that he did. Now, star potential robberies don't always manifest. Sometimes the fight just isn't close enough. I was pretty surprised that Sean O'Malley didn't just get one over Merab, even though I feel like Merab had a pretty easy argument for a 49-46. I think there was a more realistic argument for a 48-47 for O'Malley than a lot of people wanted to give credit to, which is why I'm glad at least two judges scored at 48-47 for Merab. Merab only landed one more significant strike in the first round and did get cut or had his nose bloodied a little bit. So I thought there was a very slim argument for damage for O'Malley in that first round, and I was surprised that Uncle Dana didn't make the call to protect one of his golden geese, because all of a sudden Pereira's indisputably the biggest star that the UFC has, which I don't think anybody saw coming a year ago, particularly after the loss to Adesanya, and it's looking kind of grim in terms of the other champions. Now, I love Dricus du Plessis, and Merab obviously has his own, legion of fans, but most people, particularly casuals, absolutely despise the way that Merab wins all of his fights. And even though I think guys like Potiera are, entertaining in their own right, and again, someone like du Plessis probably deserves more credit as champion, and Aspinall is a guy that exclusively wins by like first round knockout, so how can you not love that? The casuals don't really have there's not really a lot of enchantment right now among casual fans except for a guy like Pereira. And I wonder how much the UFC saw that a year ago, where they were like, we've got to make sure that, we protect this guy. But I also think that it was, as I said, there was the potential to set up the trilogy fight with Adesanya that was still on the table at that point. That has now since evaporated, particularly after Izzy losing to du Plessis. But, I still think that people probably didn't expect that Pereira was going to become the biggest star the promotion has. And I think that the UFC is in a position now where they look at Pereira being 37 years old and saying, we really got to squeeze this lemon for all it's worth while we can, which leads us to why he's now fighting Khalil Rountree. Rountree enters 14-5, has not fought since December of last year against Anthony Smith, in which he got a knockout at the beginning of the third round. I took the plus 1.5 in that instance at plus money and was vindicated in that decision. Prior to that, I took both his money line and the under when he was fighting Chris Daukaus and cashed both of those on what was a very successful fight night event for me at Luque versus Dos Anjos in August. But his event prior to that was another controversial split decision with Dustin Jacoby. And if you wanted, that ended up being, nobody I don't think could have guessed at the time that it happened, but that really ended up being one of the most consequential bad split decisions in recent UFC history. Because 2 fights after that now, Rountree is getting a title shot, and Jacoby has effectively fallen out of the rankings entirely after losing to Dominic Reyes. Jacoby would have been on a 3-fight winning streak if he had been correctly rewarded that fight, in which I made him a parlay leg and picked him to win. my night would have been spoiled by the over on Qatar Allen not coming to pass because of Calvin Qatar's injury. But that was a fight where that was in the early days of the rule set getting changed to, or the judging criteria being more of a stress on damage. And so even though Jacoby totally outreigned strikes on Roundtree had like two big explosive punches that kind of staggered Jacoby back in the fight, in a fight where damage otherwise wasn't really a factor. And two of the judges gave Jacoby a loss as a result of that, even though they didn't have identical scorecards. And if you added up all of the points through the rounds, Jacoby was actually the winner. It was just a very, very ugly decision, and it left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. And I don't think anybody could have guessed that 2 fights later, Roundtree would get a title shot off of that, particularly given that Roundtree had a self-reported and somewhat self-imposed suspension for PEDs, or a tainted substance, earlier this year. So the fact that Pereira is the star status that he is, and that they're trying to squeeze the lemon for all it's worth, and that he's effectively cleaned out all of the other contenders at this point, with one notable exception, and that they're giving Roundtree a title shot off of a win over Anthony Smith last year after Roundtree's coming off of a drug suspension, really speaks to how much the UFC is valuing Pereira at this point, which is why I have spoken at length about how important it is to factor promotional push into making your betting decisions. It's one of the main reasons that I picked O'Malley to beat Merab, even though it didn't end up coming to pass. But it's also a reason, as I've alluded to earlier in this episode, why I picked a guy like Austin Hubbard over Michael Figlak. You've really got to take into account, who does the UFC stand to gain more from seeing this fight win this fight? It's bitten me in the butt before. Like I said, I took Jan over Pereira, and they gave a split decision to Pereira that I felt like he didn't deserve. But it's also vindicated some of my picks before, as I said when I picked Paddy to beat Jared Gordon, and Jared Gordon absolutely should have won that fight, but Paddy, being one of the most notable stars among casuals the UFC has, despite him being totally out of the title picture, at least at this point, Paddy ends up getting the favorable decision at home. Of course, it's also important to remember that one of the main reasons this fight is happening is because of the Makhachev injury that compromised the main event at UFC 308. The main event for this card was originally supposed to be Holloway versus Topuria. They flexed that to UFC 308. They need a late stand-in for this main event. And I remember saying, only a few weeks removed from Pereira's win over Yuri in their rematch, don't be surprised if they book Pereira again on a pretty quick turnaround to save this main event, given they are, like I said, trying to squeeze the lemon for all it's worth. And that is what has happened here. They're trying to prop up their biggest star as much as they can. That's why it's why they couldn't make the main event of this Raquel Pennington versus Juliana Pena. So I think it's important to look at all of that context going into this one. It is pretty funny to me that Pereira, was a minus 500 favorite, still is at a lot of different books. He's come down in some places, but it's just an amusing price given what his price tags were for the fight against, or both of his fights against Prochazka and his fight against Jamal Hill, that he's now catapulted into this range, which I think is basically unplayable. Especially for a fight where neither guy really has demonstrated any interest in going to the ground. there's just too much risk of one guy catching the other with some sort of explosive strike, particularly given the fact that both of these guys have been knocked out before, and that ends up compromising the result. So I'm going to be taking the under here. It was at plus money when I graded this earlier this week. It's since slimmed out a little bit, but I do expect Pereira to knock out Roundtree here pretty early on. Roundtree is someone that has been finished in the first round twice in his UFC career. Most recently against Ion Cutelaba, although I think that might have been by ground strikes, and also against Johnny Walker in the first 2 minutes of their fight in 2018. So I don't really think he's faced any nuclear hitters since that loss to Cutelaba. Certainly not Marcin Prachnio, who's mostly a kicks guy, although he ended up losing that by unanimous decision. Bukauskas wasn't a nuclear hitter. Roberson wasn't a nuclear hitter. Jacoby, not a nuclear hitter. Chris Daukaus, pretty strong hitter, but glass chin, which is why I took the under in that case. And then Anthony Smith, I mean, come on. So I do think that Roundtree, this is the most dangerous striker that he's faced in quite some time, possibly in his entire UFC career. And, even though this could get interesting the longer it goes, just because he has a lot more experience going the distance in MMA than Pereira does, I still expect Pereira to catch him with something pretty, within the first round, if not early in the second, and knock him out. But the nice thing about hedging on rounds here is that if the inverse happens and Pereira ends up getting caught by something that Roundtree delivers, because Roundtree's finished most of his own fights inside the first 2.5 minutes. I think there's only 2 knockouts he's had where they came at a time further than the 2.5 minute mark. Really, he's had all but like 2 of his wins. One was a push. The fight he had against Bukauskas went exactly 2.5 minutes. But only his fights with Jacoby and Anthony Smith went beyond that 2.5 minute mark in terms of his wins. So all of his knockouts, losses, all of his losses by finish, if you include his submission loss to Tyson Pedro, have been in the first round. I expect that to take place again here. The UFC is trying to give their greatest star another win before the end of the year, while he's still got enough juice in the tank before he ends up losing to some up-and-coming light heavyweight like Ankalaev, who obviously is much more deserving of a title shot, even with his layoff, than what Roundtree deserves. They're obviously protecting Ankalaev from Pereira, protecting Pereira from Ankalaev, rather, which just goes further back into what I was explaining earlier about, like, come on. I don't want to call this a setup spot for Pereira to win, but given all the factors that I just laid out for you from the beginning of this breakdown, it's pretty obvious where the promotional push is here. So if you want to bet Pereira at, the 400 range, that'd be on you. I think that's way too expensive. If he was, closer to somewhere inside of not inside 200, but within the 200 range, I would probably feel good about that as a favorite. But in this case, the under was at plus money. I think now it's more of a pick 'em, but I still feel much better about taking the under here, given that kind of gives you a contingency if Pereira ends up getting sparked somehow by Roundtree, than taking the Pereira money line. So give me Alex Pereira by first round knockout, and he finishes off an extremely successful year as light heavyweight champion. And we'll see what as he prepares to turn 38 next year, we'll see what the swan song of his career looks like, or if Izzy can somehow rally to become middleweight champion again and if Pereira is still holding the belt by the time that he does, if there's potentially a trilogy fight set up. But I hope not, because I was at UFC 287, and I'm glad I got to see, if not one of the most spectacular moments in UFC history, certainly the best post-fight celebration in which Pereira stole the arrows from, or Adesanya stole the arrows from Pereira. So I think this will be a more fruitful result for Pereira, and maybe he does end up getting knocked out in the same way that he did in that fight, but I don't see it. Give me Pereira by first round knockout of Khalil Rountree. And that's going to do it for the MMA Racks Pod for UFC 307. Thank you very much for tuning in. Let me give you one more reminder to like, share, and subscribe. I will be back for UFC 308, Topuria versus Holloway, which will be taking place in a handful of weeks, thankfully also inside of October. Prior to that, though, I believe we will have a couple of fight nights, Brandon Royval versus Tetsuro Taira, as well as one that I'm very much looking forward to, one of my favorite fighters, Anthony Fluffy Hernandez, against one of my, as previously detailed, betting nemesis, Michel Pereira. You can probably guess which way I'm going to be leaning in that one, but I'll still be looking forward to it a lot. But yeah, I'll have minute to minute breakdowns out for both of those events. Once again, I apologize for not having those last week, but again, it's free, don't cost nothing. So I hope you guys enjoy the content for how it's coming out. So thank you once again for making the last episode of the Racks Pod the second most viewed out of all of them since it started. Hopefully can keep building on that, and hoping for a more successful pay-per-view than the last two have been, hopefully more akin to 304, 303, or 301. So we'll see how the picks go. Obviously hedging on 3 unders in this case at pretty close to pick-em odds at this point in terms of all of them, so we'll see how many are fruitful at the altitude in Salt Lake. But thank you very much for tuning in, and like I said, I'll be back for UFC 308 on the Racks Pod, so take care, folks.